Hi, Fred. How are you?
I'm doing great, Mike. How are you today?
Well, great. I'm good. I'm good. Well, welcome to our, webcast. We're going to talk a little bit about infrastructure hygiene and patching and updating and really keeping everything kind of updated where it needs to be. And this is actually, so I guess we should introduce ourselves first, right? Because we're old friends, so we shouldn't probably assume that everybody else knows who we are. I'm Mike Rothman. I
True.
am president and principal of a boutique research firm called Securosis. We do security, right? That's all we do. It's all I've done pretty much for the last 30 something years, many of which I've known my cohort here, Fred Koss. So Fred, you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Fred Coast. I work for Oracle. I run product marketing for our security portfolio. I've been doing security a long time, and that's, Mike, why we're connected from some number of years ago. I won't count those, but
Yeah.
always fun conversation with Mike. So look forward to chatting today.
Yeah, no, it's going to be fun, and really kind of the catalyst for the discussion is a research paper that we wrote and Oracle has licensed, which you will get a link to at the end of the event. That really does talk about kind of infrastructure security hygiene and how that's the first line of defense, and it's really something that is near and dear to my heart. I mean, it's a drum I've been beating for really the past 20 years that we don't do a good enough job at the blocking and tackling in order to eliminate a lot of these specific issues that result in breaches, that result in mistakes. And yeah, by the way, it's not always a malicious thing. I mean, a lot of times it is malicious, but it's not always malicious. In a lot of cases, it's kind of like an own goal. If you're a football, depending on where you are in the world, or soccer, depending on where you are in the world fan, we see a lot of own goals in security, right? Just making stupid mistakes and that providing a foothold for attackers to be able to get in and do bad stuff. So I've been talking about hygiene and the importance of hygiene for a long time. And the industry has sort of gotten there, but it's really been much more focused on the endpoint side of things, right? Let's make sure all those devices that we have out there are patched. Let's make sure our mobile devices are up to date. We haven't, and we've kind of forgotten about the infrastructure components that run all this stuff, right? Our networks, our switches, our servers, our databases, right? A lot of our load balancers, right? A lot of our kind of core infrastructure is the same thing, right? They're devices, they have issues, they need to be updated and patched, they need to be configured securely, and those hygiene motions are just not as mature as they need to be. And the downside's pretty severe, right? When we look back at, kind of a lot of the issues that we've had over the last, really high profile issues, little things like Heartbleed, right? Heartbleed was an issue in the underlying kind of transport of the internet. That needed to be patched, right? That's infrastructure stuff, right? We see issues with, kind of data storage environments. We see issues with networks. We see issues with load balancers, and this has to be factored in. And it's really critical to take a programmatic approach to this, really to think about it as kind of a system, something that you do just like buying something, right? You just want to make sure that you've got those motions well worn and in place for when it is that, again, something, kind of goes down. And by the way, the world, as we know, is getting a lot more complicated. So, Fred, it was probably holiday time and we were all trying to, kind of kick back and take it easy a little bit in our basements and, kind of our home offices and that kind of stuff. But, there was this little, kind of issue. A company called SolarWinds had a little problem that now we know of as a supply chain attack, right? So we're starting to not just see, kind of folks going after these specific components, but compromising a tool that you use. Right. So that also impacts how you have to think about hygiene from a lot of your infrastructure components. So, and we're moving towards cloud, we're moving towards SaaS, we're moving towards platform services. So, I mean, my point here, and really the reason why we ended up writing the report and why it was interesting for Oracle to license was because the world is getting a lot more complicated. We have to get a lot better in terms of keeping all of this stuff, up to date and making sure that you've got a system, right? A programmatic approach so that you can do it consistently and successfully over a long period of time, because the attackers are now automated. So if you mess up once, they're going to find it, right? They're going to find it. So again, a lot of it gets back to just doing the right stuff consistently over and over again. And again, I think that that's a great segue, Fred, to bring you back into the conversation and start talking a little bit about operationalizing. I'm not even sure that's a word. I don't know what Webster has to, kind of say about that, but I certainly know what you're talking about from that perspective. But I mean, how do we get to the point where, kind of you're doing a good job of the operational motions around a lot of these infrastructure components?
Yeah, I think you brought some really good points, Mike. It's sort of, I think sometimes we get enamored with the shiny object. Let's go put some new technology in place, or go, deal with this fringe attacker technique that, might let them get in if they did just the right things. And you talk about hygiene, it's, going back in time, we see it time and time again. Leave something unpatched, don't put patches in place, and inevitably bad things will happen. And I think maybe what's changed is that you can't put your focus on patching. Oh, I've got my most critical stuff patched, but this other stuff over here, it's obscure, I don't use it that much, I just won't patch it, I'll just let it go. Well, most attackers, they're not after that obscure device to steal the data there. That's a point in. So these unpatched systems that might be older, you may think, these are kind of under the radar. Juicy target for an attacker to get in, use that as a launching point to go somewhere else. And so, yes, this hygiene is critically important. And left unattended to, we always see it leads to problems. Look at some big breaches, small breaches, an unpatched vulnerabilities often, if not a human error mistake somewhere else, it's often the source of that attack.
They do dev systems, right? And we see that a lot, right? Kind of folks that are just building some stuff, they're playing around, they forget to turn it off, or they forget to close it down. They've opened up some stuff because it was more convenient. And obviously in the production area, they, have, and they do have motions to lock that stuff down. But as you said, right, it's about gaining a foothold in the environment. And once they're in, right? And it, becomes very difficult to prevent that kind of lateral movement, once folks are able to, kind of get that persistent, presence within your environment. So again, what we're trying to do, right? What we're trying to do is make it harder, right? Reduce the likelihood. You can't eliminate the likelihood, right? We've been doing this too long, both of us, right? We've been doing this too long to think that we can eliminate the likelihood, but we're trying to reduce the likelihood that we're going to make it easy for the attackers. And again, a lot of these unpatched issues, it's low hanging fruit, right? I mean, we always tell the story and we can pick on them a little bit, right? But the day after Patch Tuesday is always Exploit Wednesday, right? Because the adversaries take the patches that come out of, kind of what, and it could be Microsoft, but every vendor does the same thing. And the attackers reverse engineer the patch, right? So they know what the issue is that got fixed, kind of by the patch. And you need to, again, you need to factor that in, the fact that a lot of these things can be weaponized very quickly. And it forces us to really compress the window for when we can and need to do a lot of these updates.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge accountability factor. If you choose not to put the patch in place, or you do something as an alternative to the patch, could be different options. We can talk about a few of those, but if a breach happens, if bad things happens, somebody will be held accountable. We've seen people testify in Congress, we've seen fines. There is a certain accountability. It brings to mind a story when I was younger. Went to the lake, had a Jeep with a friend. We were going to the lake, thought, well, what are we with the keys? I'll just hide them here in the car. We came back, the car was gone, and kind of obvious what happened. When the police came, they said, well, let's find who stole this, how'd they break in? And it was quite an embarrassing moment. I said, well, I left the keys like under the seat. If you have a breach and if you left the keys under the seat when the authorities come or they're imposing fines, it's not going to be a good day. So I think there's an accountability. We talked about the hygiene and making decisions on, can I patch, and it's Wednesday and does everything work? But then there's a huge accountability factor the companies face, if they do not put the patch in place for some reason, conscientiously decide not to do it. And that's different than maybe I missed a system somewhere and it was, obscure over in a corner. When you conscientiously decide, hey, I'm not going to patch this, I'm going to assume that risk, we've seen it can come back and bite organizations.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit because I think that's actually a pretty interesting, kind of topic, right? How do you make that decision, right? Do you make that decision? Is there anything where you say, I've got and do you get to a point where you have to choose sometimes maybe based upon uptime, right? I just can't pull this thing down because the nature of the patch requires downtime and maybe I can't do that. So, where does risk fit into, kind of this hygiene process and what folks need to consider as they are operationalizing a lot of these hygienic motions? I'll say that 10 times fast.
Put operationalize in front of it, and that would be good. Well, I think there's gray areas. If you patch and put your best effort forth, something happens, there could still be consequences, but at least, Mike took his, best effort. He put the patch in place. He did everything he could to mitigate that risk. So that accountability is kind of addressed. The other extreme, if Mike does nothing and says, oh, I'm busy on Wednesday, I'm not going to patch. Okay, then there's probably full accountability. Something happens. You don't have a lot of defenses that you could argue. And then I think there's kind of in between. And you and I have been tracking security for a long time. And there's, mitigation things you can do. If you can't patch, you could try to, do virtual patching with some kind of technology to try to, detect the sequence of events coming across the wire or in the logic that would, exercise a vulnerability and try to block it. And those could be, potentially helpful mitigating steps. But, having worked at some of those companies, I know the fidelity is a challenge. The term false positive really came to mean something for a lot of us in security, but the fidelity, its effectiveness is never 100%. So it's a risk assumption. I'm going to do this in hopes that it's good enough to stop something until I can put the patch
short term, right? And I
short
think
term,
that's
right? That's never a good long term.
That's right.
Because it's never. I mean, from the accountability perspective, that's never a good long term choice. But also from a technology perspective, things change, protocols, lots of tech. It's a moving target. Attackers don't keep using the same exploit against the same vulnerability. They try things as much as, I'm trying to stop them. They're trying to evade detection. So it can be, a very short-term attempt to fix the vulnerability. Not high quality, always not high fidelity, but it definitely doesn't. It's not a long-term strategy.
It is, and I also think that as folks continue to do this business transformation thing, right? And whether it's moving towards the cloud, whether it's re-architecting in, more of an agile and or DevOps, continuous deployment, type of approach, regardless of where the stuff runs, right? I think you have to start factoring in resilience into, kind of that architecture, right? Because, in a perfect world, I wouldn't want to do a virtual patch because I can just patch the components that I need, redeploy them as need be, right? And kind of cycle out the sessions and life looks a lot easier. And we have options like that now. In the old days, right, we didn't have options like that. So we had to schedule our maintenance windows and, somebody would get pissy and, it was, kind of holiday time and you couldn't bring something down, but there was this nasty exploit. And it really was, in a lot of cases, an existential problem for a lot of organizations. But now through architecture, right, through resilience and kind of making sure that you've got things, kind of built in the right way, we can start to work around a lot of these issues and really operationalize from the standpoint based on the way we can do things, right? Based on the motions for how we build and ultimately deploy technology, which gives us, again, a lot of options. So just to net this out, right? There is a time and a place for a virtual patch. Hopefully it is a short-term, type of situation for a lot of reasons, kind of not exact on the technology and ages out pretty quickly. But if you're dealing with, very fixed maintenance windows on the back end, sometimes you may not have another option, and that's fine, right? But just we want to be very clear. I want to be clear. I'm sure Fred, you'll echo this. We don't think that is, kind of the longer term answer is to, stick an IPS in front of your stuff and say, well, that's good enough, right? I mean, we've always, again, being old security folks, right? We've always kind of believed in this defense in depth thing, right? So the IPS is a thing, right? But that's in front of a number of other things that we're doing to make sure that, again, we're giving ourselves the best opportunity to successfully, kind of block attacks.
Yeah. Well, and I think, Mike, the other thing we kind of zeroed in on a patch being fixing a known disclosed vulnerability, some logic bug, and that patch is going to fix that. So the software no longer has that, I'll call it a defect. It should have never existed, but it doesn't have that flaw. But also, you and I have been in the software industry for quite a while. Patches, if we're evaluating our software and there's a known disclosed vulnerability, we have a CV and we're tracking it, we go in and we fix it up. But just like, the surgeon opens up Mike to go take out your appendix, if he sees some other problems in there, while he's in there, he might give you a little tune-up and fix some things. And I think often patches also may fix vulnerabilities that either have not been disclosed or aren't even known to the world because no one's ever found them, or the logic's improved and tightened up. So I think you talked about hygiene. Yes, fixing a known vulnerability, hygiene that must be done. But I think also staying on the patch stream and staying up to date, probably not in every case, but often is going to fix other things that could lead to a problem. So sort of a second tier of benefit or an efficacy that the patch provides that is sometimes overlooked.
Yeah, and back to my point about architecture before, there's make the problem, effectively operationalize, build this program, or don't even deal with it, right? So one of the things that we work on with a lot of clients nowadays is how do you take existing components and move them into, whether it's a SaaS environment, a platform environment, right, where you're no longer responsible for a lot of the care and feeding, maintenance, updating that, kind of your provider. And to be clear, you have to go through the risk management process to make sure that you trust that provider to do the right stuff, that they've got the right operational motions, that they've got a resilient architecture, that you're not going to have downtime and all of those kinds of things. But that's another option, right? Which is to really start thinking about these new kind of, and I mentioned with an agile architecture, a cloud-based architecture, whatever you want to call it, we can start using platform services in place of a lot of our traditional infrastructure components, which again makes that problem not my problem anymore into the service provider's problem. And that, does reduce your attack surface in some cases rather dramatically. So that's also something to consider as you, start relooking at these operational motions, but also the architectures of your basic applications.
Yeah, that the whole, as you move to cloud, look at moving to the cloud, the shared responsibility model really does shift some of that burden of responsibility to the provider, not 100%, but a large chunk. And things like, if I put on my Oracle hat for a minute, we have customers that moved to our SaaS applications. They don't have to build the servers, run the servers, they don't have to patch the servers. This patching hygiene we talked about, it moves across, all that's taking care of them. And if you look at things like, within the portfolio we have, things like autonomous database, autonomous Linux, we're automating the patching. It's still a platform. Mike's still running, your database. It's not fully a SaaS deployment, but the patching's automated and fully taken care of. So the problem is getting better from that perspective, but doesn't sort of lessen the importance of patching, on premises, critical infrastructure, all the things you described earlier, Mike. So it's very true. And there's a great paper on the Oracle website. You could do a search on good hygiene patching. You'll find the PDF that captures a lot of the ideas that Mike's talked about today.
No, that's right. And again, just to kind of net it out, and again, we'll just do another little plug for the Securosis paper that you can get on the Oracle website, as well as a lot of other information that the Oracle folks have about, kind of operational, kind of good hygiene and how to manage your systems. It really is about just being much more aware of the problem and thinking about your infrastructure just like you do your endpoints, things that need to be updated, that need to be managed. And if anything, how important it is to stay current with, kind of the latest and the greatest, because again, we know how these adversaries work, right? The attackers go and they check out what the latest, kind of patches are that are available, and they weaponize those. And if you're not prepared, right, as we like to say, if you can't defend against something like Metasploit or a new patch, it's going to be a long day in the office for you, right? Because those are things that anybody can download and use in order to gain a foothold in your environment.
Mike, it's been great chatting with you today. Thanks for taking time. It's always good to catch up. Look forward to seeing you in person in the coming weeks, months.
Yes, that will be fantastic. You bet. Great to see you too, Fred.
All right. See you, Mike.